Welcome to this panel. This is the second panel in a series on a state of the world that OPR is organizing. The topic here is a very important topic. It's 8 billion people. That's a large number. And we're going to talk about challenges and opportunities for the next 50 years. For the motivation, in November 2022, the world population surpassed 8 billion people. Both fertility and mortality have dropped. And so we're talking in most countries now, fertility stands at replacement rate or below replacement rate, though there are some areas where this is not still the case, and we'll talk about that today. And people are living longer and healthier lives. Still, challenges remain regarding unequal access to global resources, with ensuing rising migration rates, as well as pressure on the environment. This panel brings together thinkers from policy academic domains to examine the future population trends, including fertility and mortality, and its implications on migration patterns and public health outcomes. And our discussion today will focus on opportunities and challenges of those trends posed for ensuring the well-being of present and future generations. So I have the pleasure of having 4 wonderful speakers today. I'm very thrilled that they all accepted the invitation. We have this distinguished set of speakers, all have very strong research track in areas of demography, and also the interesting thing is that they come from very diverse geographic scope in their research. So we're going to be able to cover a lot of ground, which is the goal of the panel. And before opening the floor to each one of the individual presentations, that's how we're going to proceed. Each one of them is going to have around 10 minutes to present their ideas and their outline. And then after that, we will sit around the table. We'll start with maybe 1 or 2 questions and open it to the public, and also open it to the people who are online. So let me first introduce briefly each one of them. Our first speaker is Dr. John Wilmot. He holds a PhD in statistics and demography from Princeton University. And since 2013, he has been the director of the United Nations Population Division. Before that, he had a very distinguished career as professor at the Department of Demography at the University of California, Berkeley. And previously, he served at the Population Division as chief of mortality section for a few years. Dr. Wilmot is the author of more than 50 scientific papers around various aspects of population dynamics, including historical decline of mortality, prospect for future trends in life expectancy, impact of population aging on public pensions and healthcare systems, and many more. He has served as consultant to the World Health Organizations and the World Bank, and he has served in the editorial board of the leading demographic journals. Second speaker, Professor Alex Esses, is professor of global health in the Department of Community Health and Prevention at the Dornsife School of Public Health. He holds degrees in sociology from Imo State University, master in sociology from the University of Ibadan, and a master and PhD in demography from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Esses brings decades of experience in research capacity strengthening, and policy advocacy on a range of global health and development issues. He served as the founding executive director of the African Population and Health Research Center, and helped it become one of the Africa's foremost regional research centers addressing population, education, and development issues. He initiated and directed the Consortium of Advanced Research Training in Africa and the African Doctoral Dissertation Research Fellowship. He works on urban slum health, population dynamics in sub-Saharan Africa, and models to strengthen knowledge-based institutions in Africa. He provides guidance to a range of institutions and has received multiple prizes and honorary degrees, including the World Academy of Sciences Prize and the London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine, Royal Society, George MacDonald Medal. Our third speaker is Marcela Cerruti. She has a PhD in sociology from the University of Texas, Austin, with a specialization in population studies. She was a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania Population Studies Center. Currently, she's a principal researcher at the National Council of Scientific and Technical Research at the Center of Population Studies in Argentina and a full professor at the National University of San Martin. She was director of CENEP and vice president of the Latin American Association of Population. Currently, she's a member of IUC's panel on international migration and has been consultant for several international organizations, including CELADE, UNDP, UNICEF, and name many, as well as Argentinian government. Her research interests include intra-regional migrations in South America, gender, family, migration, and migration policies and human rights. And last but not least, we have our own Jim Raimo, who's a professor of sociology and Henry Wen Professor of East Asian Studies at Princeton University. He earned his PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan. Raimo is a social demographer whose research focused on documenting and understanding the causes and potential consequences of demographic changes associated with population aging in Japan. His published research includes analysis of marrying, marriage timing, divorce, recession and fertility, marriage and women's health, single mothers' well-being, living alone, family changes, and so on. Lots of his current projects are too many to summarize, but just to give you a couple: single mothers and fertility in Japan, and also COVID mitigation policies and demographic outcomes in China. His research has been published in leading US journals as well as Japanese journals. He serves on the board of directors of the PAA and is associate editor of the Journal of Gerontology and of Demography. So we welcome the four of them and are looking forward to hearing from them.
Okay. Getting set up here. I think I've spoken in this room before. I'm not sure. It looked very much like this a few years ago. Thank you for the invitation and for the nice introduction. Alicia, it's great to be back at Princeton. I don't recognize anything. The Cannon Club has people hanging out and partying in there now. That used to be the OPR, but that really dates me. But yes, I left in 1988, so go figure. A lot has happened since then. So I'm happy to join you for this discussion about global population and the implications of current and projected demographic trends for people and the planet over the next several decades. Population Division of the UN was founded in 1946 to support the member states of the United Nations in their discussions around population issues. The Population Commission met for the first time in 1947, and it was renamed as the Commission for Population and Development in the mid-90s. Therefore, for more than 75 years, the Population Division has provided not only administrative support to governments as they discuss issues around population change, it is also focused on producing major collections of demographic data, most notably the World Population Prospects series, which is often referred to by the acronym of WPP. And the WPP provides detailed population data for 235 countries or areas of the world, which together comprise the total population of the Earth. For individual countries and areas, the data set includes detailed estimates by age, sex, year, and location of population size and of the three components of population change: fertility, mortality, and international migration. So last year, as many of you probably know, in 2022, the Population Division produced a major update of the information contained in the WPP. The data were offered in much more detailed formats by single years of age and single calendar years. And the methods used for estimating the past and current estimates and the future projections of population trends are more open and transparent. And there is better access now to the data that underlie all of the calculations that are used to generate the data set. So if you haven't had a chance to look at it, please do look at the new WPP from last year. And hopefully there's lots of stuff in there that is, it's a huge data set. Nobody can possibly exploit all of it. So there's always more to find out if you work closely with the data. The there were two headline results of last year's update of the WPP. First, the new data indicated that the world's total population would surpass 8 billion people around November of 2022. And second, the new data revealed that India would surpass China to become the world's most populous country around April of this year, 2023. Of course, those were the headliners, but one can reasonably ask two questions for each. One, how accurate are the estimated dates of the two milestone events? And second, how significant are those events? Well, the answer to the first question is that these are the best estimates that we could produce with the data available, but we know and acknowledge that they may over or underestimate the true values. The true dates of the two milestones may differ by a year or more from our estimates. But nevertheless, those are the best estimates that we have based on the information that we have. We didn't cook them all. We didn't choose the dates. It came out to be November 15th. That's just the day when the curve crossed the line. And it was not cooked at all. It was just, that's how it came out. The exact date of the milestone may be less important than the fact that we are reaching these milestones sometime around 2022 and 2023. Over the past 50 years, the world's population has doubled from around 4 billion in 1974, that's the estimate, to 8 billion in 2022. So over those 48 years, there were 4 additional billion people added, and each of them took approximately 12 years. As we look forward, our projections indicate that the time required to increase the global population by 1 billion people will increase. We had 4 billions in a row. There was roughly 12 years each time, and in the future, it's going to take longer. We project that the next billion, the 9th billion, will reach 9 billion. It's not the 9th billion, but we will reach 9 billion people total. The projection is that it'll happen around 2037, so that would be 15 years. And then 10 billion will take another 20 years to get to 10 billion, we project in 2058. So one of the important points here is that the growth of the world's population continues, but it is slowing down. So we're going to see that here. We've got some graphs. So I'm not sure these are organized in the best order and so forth. I apologize for that. But one of the key points to this discussion is that the demographic transition is a global phenomenon. Okay, and this is what underlies, I think, everything that we're talking about today is the demographic transition. It's really the organizational device, the theory that underlies the work that we do. Of course, it consists of a decline of mortality and fertility, which has been happening in all countries or areas of the world. So this is a very important point, is that this is basically a universal phenomenon. All major populations of the world have been undergoing this change. And it has two major consequences. One is population growth, and the second is population aging. And there are differences in timing of the demographic transition, as I'm sure you're aware. Different countries are at different stages of this process of the demographic transition, and that has produced considerable demographic diversity in the world today. So on the one hand, you have some countries that have still rather high fertility, not as high as it was historically. It's already been declining almost everywhere, but relatively high levels of fertility in some countries, which produces still rapid growth and youthful populations. At the other extreme, you've got some countries with very low levels of fertility, slow or negative population growth, and much older populations, and becoming older and older all the time. As I said, the growth of the global population continues, but it is slowing down. And that's illustrated by this graph here, which shows you the increase of the total population over time, hitting around 8 billion. You've got to read the axis on the right and on the left for the growth rate. But so the curve continues to go up, but the growth rate, the percent increase per year has been declining steadily since around 1970, when it reached a peak of just around 2% per year. And just recently, in 2022, we estimate that the growth rate fell for the first time below 1% per year over this time period. It's the first time that we've seen the growth rate of under 1%, and we anticipate that it will continue to fall until it basically hits zero and the world stops growing. The global population stops growing sometime toward the end of this century. And yeah, it's supposed to level off. It's leveling off around the 2080s. That graph looks a little skeptical about whether it's really leveling off at the right point. But it's in the 2080s. I can tell you that it's the projection is that it will level off around 10.4 billion, possibly decline slightly. We don't really know at that point, but basically just become fairly flat at that point in the 2080s moving forward. The growth rate will continue to go down, therefore will hit zero around that same time. The world, just to illustrate the diversity of the situation in the world, this map shows you the total fertility rate by country or area in 2021. And so the dark blue areas are those areas that have relatively high levels of fertility. You can see mostly located in sub-Saharan Africa, and other areas in the light green that have much lower levels of fertility. If you notice, everything that's kind of in turquoise or light green anything that's in the light green is below 2.1 births per woman over a lifetime. So those parts of the world now have below replacement level fertility. And it's most of the world. It's about 2/3 of the global population now lives in a country or area with total fertility rate of below 2.1 births per woman over a lifetime. So, even India kind of joined that group in the last decade, which kind of, immediately pushed us up to around 2/3 of the global population. But that's quite significant. But there is considerable diversity. There are parts of the world that are still growing rapidly, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. So, there is a habit, I think, in the world of in the discussions around population issues of throwing around big numbers and stoking fear of the future based on those big numbers. It's a very common approach in these sorts of discussions. Julian Simon once said, "Bad news sells," and I think that's a very true observation. Okay. So, but I think we need to dig a little deeper than just to see these big numbers and say, "Oh, we're going to destroy the world with so many people," and to think a little bit more carefully about what the consequences of these large-scale demographic changes may be, both positive and negative. So to do that, we have to focus on these two major global trends, which are both the product of the demographic transition, population growth, and population aging. And I've already linked them to the demographic transition. So I guess I have 4 key messages for you here today. The first is that the demographic transition is a global phenomenon with 2 major consequences: population growth and population aging. And here's just another illustration of the growth curve and showing the uncertainty intervals around our estimates, but this illustrates that the growth continues and will continue, but there's not so much uncertainty around 2050 about the range of estimates is still rather narrow, but it widens quite a bit to where you have a range of almost 4 billion by the end of the century. So the first point is that this demographic transition is global and it has these 2 major consequences. The demographic transition can be described with just 4 words. I've been doing this for many years with students: longer lives, smaller families. That's the simple way to think about it. Of course, it's not really about smaller families, it's about lower fertility, but saying fewer children, it's just list, I don't know, it just doesn't capture people's imagination quite the way as smaller families. So that's my 4-word definition. So these are 2 defining features of the modern world, that people live longer today than our ancestors did even 100 or 200 years ago. And this increased survival causes growth. And when most babies survive the challenges of infancy and early childhood, that adds to the population. And when they survive in greater numbers to adulthood and begin to have children of their own, then they contribute to population growth both through their increased survival and also by their childbearing. Once mortality rates fall, of course, it's no longer necessary to bear and raise as many children per adult in order to maintain a constant population size. And so eventually, fertility levels tend to fall as well as mortality until reaching a level that no longer generates rapid growth. In many countries, we have seen fertility fall to levels that produce population decline if maintained for many years. They fall below that replacement level of 2.1. In some countries, after the historical declines of mortality and fertility are well advanced, international migration begins to play a more important role in shaping population dynamics. So a key point is that this demographic transition has happened or is in the process of happening in all countries or areas of the world. There are no large populations unaffected by these global trends. The first major consequence of these trends is that populations grow rapidly during the period when mortality has fallen but fertility remains relatively high. Then second, as more people live to older ages and as the number of births per woman declines, the age distribution of population shifts toward older ages, phenomenon of population aging. And so although the entire world is undergoing these kinds of changes, the process is unfolding at different times and different speeds all across the world. And the result is that we are currently in a period of considerable demographic diversity, with the two extremes that I described earlier and everything in between. So the next major point, well, this is just interesting fact that most of the growth is accounted for in just 8 countries. Eight countries account for half the growth, or will account for half the growth between 2022 and 2050. And this shows you some of the regional patterns, which one thing that really stands out, of course, is Africa continuing to increase, while the two large parts of Asia, the Eastern and Southern Asia, and then the Central and Southern, Southeastern and Southeastern, and Central and Southern, both kind of leveling off and will stop increasing, or they already have stopped in the case of Eastern and Southeastern Asia, and Central and Southern Asia will stop increasing over the next few decades, but Sub-Saharan Africa will continue to increase. And it's expected that Sub-Saharan Africa will contribute over half of the global increase through 2050. So, boy, I'm going to come back to that one because that requires a little explanation and maybe it's more important once we get there. So I guess the second major point here is that rapid growth has negative consequences, mainly in 2 contexts. So people are very concerned about growth. Some of the reasons that people are concerned about growth maybe aren't reasons to be so concerned about them. I think people used to be concerned we would run out of oil or we'd run out of resources, and that's not really happening. But other things are happening that are a problem. And we published a report last year in Population Division called Global Population Growth and Sustainable Development, which tries to take on this topic in a comprehensive way. And we focused on these 2 contexts in which we thought this is where it matters. This is where rapid growth really does have negative consequences. First, in some developing countries, especially those who are relatively low income or lower middle income countries that face many disadvantages for their development, rapid growth just adds one more complexity to that. It makes it more and more difficult to keep up with, expanding the educational system, to keep up with the growth of population, and it just presents other challenges that overall the countries would probably be better off with slower rates of growth. It's not that it destroys any chance of developing. It's still possible to develop successfully, economically, and socially in the presence of rapid growth, but in situations where countries have many disadvantages in their development prospects, growth adds one more challenge to them. And the second context in which people have been talking about growth, and I think it's very valid, is it has to do with the environmental damage. It's not a question of running out of resources and, we will find the oil to run the machine, that we will continue to do that. But the question is, what will be the consequences of running that machine? And so there we get into issues around climate change and other environmental concerns that population growth contributes to them, but it's not the driving force in most cases. So yes, we talked about this. Yeah. The differences in timing are triggering an unprecedented supply of and demand for international migrants. True, and this is kind of this goes into population aging, which is we come to my second point here in a minute, but it has to do with population aging, which is happening all over the world. You can see in many parts of the world, we expect a doubling even of the percentage of people above age 65 between now and 2050. And some parts of the world will have more than 25% of the population in that age range. So then this is the relationship with migration, which basically what this is showing you is that if you divide the world in a very simplistic way into more developed and less developed regions, you find that growth in the more developed regions is going to be driven almost entirely by migration over the next few decades. The growth due to natural change, where the balance of births over deaths is going negative in those areas, and the only thing that's sustaining growth is immigration. On the other hand, the less developed regions where you've got large populations that are still growing overall, migration is a relatively minor part of the picture. It's a small percentage that kind of leave those areas, but it's small. They're small numbers compared to the growth that's taking place due to the excess of births over deaths. So, this is out of place. Okay, well, we're into discussion of population aging. I'm sorry, I told you it wasn't super well organized, but the second major concern, I would say, my third point and the second issue around these demographic changes relates to population aging. And it is a universal and inevitable consequence of the demographic transition. And there are the concerns that exist in some countries revolve around pension systems. But it's important to remember, because in the rich countries, we're very concerned about whether pension systems are sustainable. But it's important to remember that for most countries of the world, for most of the world's population, they don't have a pension system that's going to support them in older ages. And so, our first concern should be growing pension systems for the rest of the world, and are encouraging that and facilitating that in any ways that we can, supporting it. But of course, it has to come ultimately from the governments themselves. But the concern about sustainability sometimes overshadows the lack of coverage pension systems in the world. And I think we, as demographers in a rich country here, we should keep that in mind. There's a rapid increase in the need. There are various concerns about population aging. One is about the pension systems. They're underdeveloped in many countries, and there's no public safety net for older persons. But pension systems in countries with more resources tend to be well funded and relatively generous, but there are concerns about the long-term sustainability. And there's a rapid increase in the need for care, both institutionalized and in private settings. So there are concerns about the costs of care. There are also concerns about gender inequality and the provision of care. These two things are very much linked. Gender inequality intersects with population aging issues because of unequal access to pensions, because of work histories and eligibility rules mean that many women are disadvantaged in terms of the income stream at older ages. And there's also an unequal sharing of responsibilities for care, both in the formal economy and privately. The care economy is not well integrated into the formal economy. Where it's integrated, workers, mainly women and immigrants, tend to be poorly paid. And where it's not integrated, work is often not being compensated. And the social expectation that women will provide such care for free tends to exacerbate gender inequality. And so as the populations age and as there's more and more demand for care, this is a concern that we need to be aware of and react to properly. So one thing to keep in mind is that the discussion around population aging is often very negative. The public perspective often has a very strong negative bias, but we as demographers know it's a great success. This happened because of one of the greatest human achievements that's ever been, is the extension of the human lifespan. And that's what caused population aging. So whenever you get into a discussion about this and somebody says, oh yeah, the world's growing old, we're gonna have all these old people to take care of it, remind them that is our success. First and foremost, that is our success. And, we can find ways to deal with that, frankly. I'm less worried about those issues than some of the environmental climate change issues, frankly. So there are opportunities as well as challenges. Keeping older persons engaged in the workforce can help to mitigate the shifting balance of the working age to older populations. So it's a question of exploiting the opportunities that are there, not only responding to the challenges. So here in my concluding point, the fourth point is that population trends are not inherently good or bad. In general, major demographic trends reshape our world But the changes they bring do not necessarily spell disaster. There are ways to react and to adapt to all of these changes. Underlying these changes is the greatest success in human history, the increase of human survival. But population change presents many challenges. We need adjustments in institutions and behaviors. Societies can adapt, but adaptation is easier when changes come more slowly. The biggest challenge comes from rapid demographic change, rapid growth, rapid decline, rapid aging. This is what's very challenging. With more time, it's easier to adapt. Governments have a legitimate interest in moderating demographic extremes, but policies must be implemented with full respect for human rights. And this includes the basic right to choose freely and responsibly the number of children people have and the timing of their births. And with that, I conclude and turn over to the next speaker.
Thank you for starting us off greatly, John, and thank you, Alicia and Sani, for inviting me to this conversation. So can I just maybe remind you a couple of things that have been said already in the presentations this evening? People are living longer and healthier lives, and John put it differently, longer lives, smaller families. John talked about the change in population growth, and after 2080 or thereabout, it will be fairly flat after that period. And that the period of demographic, that we are in a period of demographic diversity, that adaptation is easier when change comes more slowly. Did you hear all those? Okay, so we can move to my presentation. I want to focus on number 2, number 3, possibly number 4. And I want you to be able to answer the first question. And I want you to think about the last question and maybe have some, by the end of our session this evening, be able to tell whether we do need indeed new theories and models to really understand what's going on with population. So, John talked about a period of demographic diversity. And I talk about diversity in 2 ways. It's about the changing pattern of growth of global population and the change between high-income countries and low- and middle-income countries on the other hand. So we have to look at it in those ways. If you look at the blue bars, it tells you the number of countries where the rate of growth of the population is at least 0.69% or higher. At 0.69%, the population doubles every 100 years. And historically, in Europe, that was their experience. And many demographers in the past believed that at a doubling time of 100 years, you can almost manage that rate of growth. Like John said, adaptation is easier when the growth comes, when the change comes slowly. And 100 years is a good time to actually adapt. What we have seen since 2050 is that the number of countries that are growing at this rate of growth or higher has been declining. And currently, by 1950, almost every country in the world, there are 236 countries and territories that are included in the World Population Prospect. So I'm not going to define it anymore because John has laid the background for the World Population Prospect. And every data that I'm sharing here comes from the 2022 World Population Prospects, or as noted from earlier ones. As of 2022, that number has actually dropped to 131. And by 2100, there will be only 3 countries in the whole world where the rate of growth of their population will be 0.69% or higher. That would be Niger at 1.01%, Mayotte at 0.85%, and Senegal at 0.75%. For the rest of the world, their population will be growing at much lower rates. But at the other hand of that, at the other part of that trajectory is the increasing number of countries that have negative growth rates. By negative growth rates means it is below zero, it is minus. And that number currently is at 41. By 2100, there will be 154. That would be 65% of the number of countries and territories within the report that will be experiencing negative growth. Okay. So, what does this mean? I want to underscore the fact that when you think about what the demographic future looks like, it is important to understand that the experiences of low and middle-income countries will be very different from the experiences of high-income countries and from the experiences of Europe and North America and maybe Japan. But all the models and theories we have to explain population change are actually modeled after the European experience. What are the major factors that will drive these differences? John talked on a lot of them. But I talk about the pace of fertility decline. I also think about the inability of countries to deal and address with issues of immigration and emigration. And we know, as demographers, we talk about population momentum, but we don't actually talk about reverse momentum and how that could drive future changes in population. And so I want to just focus a little bit on the limited time I have on just touch on these things. So here, I show you the example in the solid lines. I think I can talk through this. The red is the UK. The total fertility rate is on the left. And the blue is the UK and the red is Jamaica. I take two countries that in the 2022 revision, you look at their total fertility rate. The UK, their total fertility rate, highest point of about 5.7 children per woman, they experienced that in about 1800. That was when they peaked at 5.7. It took them about 140 years to about 1940 to go below replacement level. If you go to France, it's actually over 200 years, from 1700 to the 1900s, before they could move from a peak to the below replacement level. Almost every low and middle-income country that have achieved below replacement level fertility has been able to do it in less than 2 to 3, 4 decades. In Jamaica, they achieved that from 1965 to 2005. That's about 40 years. Because European countries had hundreds of years of experience of decline, slow decline, they've been able to adapt to those changes. Because fertility had declined very fast and very rapidly in many low and middle-income countries, it's going to affect how their population decline unfolds going forward. So just to conclude on this, the dotted line tells you the rate of growth, which is plotted on the right. And even though the total fertility rates for Jamaica and the UK are similar from now to the end of the century, their rate of growth is completely very different. The UK remains at about 0. Jamaica will be declining at 3.3% per year. That means every 34 years, the population will drop by about 50%. Okay. What does this mean? I showed here, also from the WPP, World Population Prospects, Jamaica on top and the UK in the bottom, what their population looks like today in 2023 and what it will look like in 2100. So even though the UK will change from about 67 million to 70 million people between now and 2100, Jamaica will change from about 2.9 million in 2023 to 890,000. That's a 70% drop in the population of Jamaica. So even though population decline is inconsequential for the UK. It is an existential issue for Jamaica. So when we think about population decline, and we look at it in terms of aging, it is far beyond aging. For many of these countries, it is a matter of life and death. And what everything is driving that? I talked about the fast decline in fertility, but also issues of migration. Rich countries have been able to design, because they have hundreds of years of declining fertility and all that, they've been able to design policies that attract young people from poorer countries. Poor countries do not have that luxury. And so, not only are they not able to attract young people, they are also faced with the high levels of immigration of their young people in search of better opportunities elsewhere. So when you look at this for Jamaica, population decline is consequential. I talked about the issue of reverse momentum. And I want to use the experience of South Korea to just talk about what could happen when we look at, when you think about the models we have of population change, we think about this period where the growth rate magically gets to zero and stays around there. We call it stable population, stationary population, and the age structure of the population is almost like a pyramid. No, not a pyramid, it's like a pillar. It's every age group is very constant and continues like that. That's the image we have. But however, when you think about South Korea, around 1985, it started a process where the age structure actually started changing. And from that period to now, you can see that defining piece where every new cohort of children being born in South Korea is much smaller than the ones above them. So by 2023, we've seen that shape fully defined. And we go up to 2050, you can see the tapering off of that younger age groups. And you can continue with this, and you see by 2100, it's almost like a funnel. And when you have a population age structure that is a funnel, it creates an inverse momentum for growth or for decline, which means you have fewer people coming into the reproductive ages than those leaving the reproductive ages. So even though, according to the World Population Prospects 2022, they are suggesting that fertility rates will recover in South Korea. And between now and 2100, will actually increase by 83% from 0.8 children per woman to about 1.4 children per woman. So even with this increase, 83% increase in fertility rates in South Korea, you still see the huge reductions in the population and population growth of South Korea. What is driving that change? I see it as the shift in the age structure of the country's population. This, in the bars, are the number of women of reproductive age in South Korea. In 2000, there are about 13.4 million women of reproductive age, 15 to 49. Currently, it's about 11.4 million. By 2100, there will be 3.4 million women of reproductive age in South Korea. Even if they double or triple their fertility, it's not going to be sufficient to offset the size of the childbearing population in the country. Now, whatever I have said so far, I just want you to understand that the UN World Population Prospects gives a much better, a more robust assessment. A more, what's the word? The projections are more generous of the change that will happen in these places. They underestimate the rate of decline in countries with rapidly declining population. And they actually underestimate the rate of growth in countries with rapidly growing population. So whatever you have seen so far for these countries, for Jamaica, for South Korea, it's going to be, that's the best scenario. The reality is that it will be worse than that. And why do I say that? This is Niger, I've not talked about countries with rapid population growth, but we know that's one of the countries with the highest rate of growth now, 3.7 or 3.8%, and then it's every 18.5 years, Niger's population is doubling. You can go back to the previous world population prospects and look at what was the projected size of Niger's population this year. And you can look at the recent projections, say what's that population now? If you look at the 1996 projection to the population of Niger by 2020, it showed that Niger will be 19.6 million people. The 2022 revision showed that Niger actually was 24.7 million or so, which means Niger actually overshoots its projected size from the 1996 report. And one of the things you will see is that every new projection pretty much shows that the population of Niger by 2100 will be larger than it was formerly projected. I think one of the things driving this is not a critique of the population division. John and his team are doing an incredible amount of work. But I think as a field, demography, we have missed certain points and critical ingredients in our methods. I think one of the things that's driving this change is age at first marriage. Age at first marriage affects the gap between mothers and daughters, or the generation. If you look at a country like South Korea, with mean age at first birth is 32. In Niger, is 18. It means in 90 years, you have 3 cohorts of women in South Korea. You have 5 cohorts of women, even if the fertility rate is the same. But we don't account for that in our projections, in our methods within the field. You can look at that also with South Korea. Every new projection, in fact, you look at the red and the blue. The blue is 2019, the red is 2022. That's a 3-year period. But within that 3-year period, the projected size of the South Korean population has dropped by 24%. So every new projection is showing the population is going to decline much faster than it was projected to decline before. Are you with me? Okay. So what do this all mean? What do this all mean? I think it is important for us to understand the European experience, and we've heard a lot about it already. And the examples from high-income countries of population change, they are very inadequate in explaining what's going on and what will continue to go on in low and middle-income countries. Their experiences will be very different from what we've seen in high-income countries. And the diversity of demographic experiences calls for an honest and well-reasoned approach to address both continuing rapid rates of growth in some regions like West and Central Africa, and some parts of South Asia and others, and rapid decline in others. We don't have the language to deal with those things currently. And there is the need to think about the discourses of negative population growth or population decline beyond aging and the care economy. I give you the example. Namibia will start to decline, but its life expectancy by 2100 is projected to be at 68. 8 years over what it is today. So they will still decline while they are young, and these countries will decline while they are poor. So this theme of longer lives, healthier lives represents the experience of Europe and North America and high-income countries. It is not the reality of low and middle-income countries. And there is need to invest in research to fully understand population decline globally. The South Korean president recently talked about the country has spent $200 billion in the last 16 years to help prop up fertility. They've achieved nothing. Somebody in the UK, I think Paul Mullen, talked about taxing childless couples and individuals. Is that, why are they not having children? Some of them are because they cannot afford to give their children the type of life they had growing up. And maybe if you're not taxing them and giving them other support, they might be able to start earlier, and that could have a significant impact on future fertility. So my conclusion is that there's a lot that we don't understand about the change in population trajectories in low and middle income countries, and we need more work to be done in this area. Thank you.
Well, this is not the name of my presentation, but I'm going to talk a bit about fertility. First of all, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm really happy to be here and to share this panel with my colleagues. We are going to travel to Latin America. That always is, you know, we are not such a huge continent. So I'm going to speak a little bit about demographic trends in the region. I'm going to use also John's data. So if you have any problems, we are going to start with the issue of population change. No, population growth has been slowing down in the region. And since about 2000, the region is growing at a slower pace than the world. Currently, we are about 660 million people, and it's expected that in 34 years, we are going to start declining when we reach about 752 million people. We know that that's not the start. Then annual growth rate is about 0.7 right now. The process is linked obviously to a significant fall in the level of fertility. Now the total fertility rate in the region is right below a replacement level, and is projected to keep going down until 2030 and to start to get stable in a level of 1.7. This fall in fertility has recently accelerated. I agree with a colleague. The fertility drop has been accelerated even in 7 years, 8 years. And there are countries in the region that have reached even levels that are compatible with very low regimes, less than 1.5, levels that are lower than 1.5, for example, in Uruguay, in Chile, and Costa Rica. This process was obviously made possible through access to contraceptive methods, but the forces that were driving these changes are undoubtedly the expansion of education, improvements in women's autonomy that reflected not only the increase in participation in the labor market, but also changes in the process of family formation, family dissolution, and couple relations. It is also important to mention the economic instability of the region as another factor that also deters people who have more children. And also, I also want to mention that the region has seen advances in gender and sexual minority rights that were unthinkable 20 years ago. These are in principle, we would say, very good news, because a decrease in fertility brings itself a potential reduction in income inequality, since drops in fertility are higher among poorer people, women, as well as in poverty, because poor people have drops in fertility are higher among poor people. Another positive aspect is that it releases demographic pressure to emigrate. But this is a tricky thing, and then we could go back later about this. Actually, people have argued that in part the lower pressures from Mexico to the US, the migration flows, relate to a decrease in demographic pressure. So the region has also show gains in life expectancy. However, they are not as large as expected. And this is mainly because there are significant differences in mortality by class, and also the relevance of mortality due to external causes, particularly among men. If we take the 16 countries with the highest homicide rates in the world, 14 are located in Latin America and the Caribbean. Also, the region was the Latin American region was the one who showed the largest loss in life expectancy in the world due to COVID. So, consequently, all these changes have changed obviously the age structure of the population. We have already seen witnessed an amazing drop in children's dependency ratio, and we expect that to change and to be accelerated in the process of aging. As it is well known, this process has straightforward effects on pension systems where they are, healthcare provisions, and provisions of elder care. Economists also have pointed out other negative effects on the aging of the working population that has to do with a decrease in productivity and savings, and even an increase in inflation. So there are negative effects on the labor market. At the beginning of we can see here the children and older people dependency ratios in Latin America. But at the beginning of the process of aging, societies undergo a period of demographic dividend, that we haven't talked about that. That is when the share of the working age population is larger than the share of the non-working age population. Therefore, there is a moment for the economies to grow. There is a kind of demographic bonus that the economy can invest money in other areas to increase productivity and growth during that period. Researchers working on this issue, on the demographic transformations and what they call the intergenerational transfers, have proposed ways to turn this demographic opportunity in a real development opportunity through investment in very concrete policies. No? One key is obviously human capital. But this is not just to increase coverage, educational coverage, but more importantly in the region is to reduce huge gaps in the quality of education among social sectors. Secondly, is the gender equality policies that will improve women's participation in the labor force, and that then we could make that base of working age population larger. These policies should include all social spheres, not just in terms of labor promotion, but through channels and changes in the social organization of care that we've been talking about that. That will help to reconcile life and work. This is a problem in countries that has very low fertility rates. One of the restraints are the incompatibility between life and work. So this means for many women in Latin America, more state presence through a welfare regime that facilitates access to child care, to elderly care, to parental leaves, and other mechanisms. As in social security systems are mainly based on worker contributions, the other problem to actually take care and better use these demographic dividends is to expand the base that the system is shrinking. And the base is imperative, and one measure to do that is to reduce employment in the informal sector, because informal sector does not contribute to the social security systems. So, and there's always the conflicting discussion about the issue of increasing retirement ages. No, we have been listening about that in many countries. Last but not least, the other mechanism that we talk about that is to compensate the reduction in the working age population is through immigration. And even though the region is still far to reach that point, we can see the role of immigration in specific countries, like for example, specific countries that had been getting older, no, like Chile and Costa Rica. But I would like to make a more general point about the issue of immigration to compensate for the process of aging. Even though immigration can ensure population stability or even population growth in advanced economies that are aging at a fast pace, there is a significant and increasing resistance to promote immigration. This is due to political resistance that is mainly based on nativist perspectives over population and nation states. And I can come back to this point later when I have a little bit more of time. So, coming back to the demographic challenges and opportunities of the region, needless is to say that we have a great deal of heterogeneity among countries. In relation, for example, to the demographic dividends, look at, I'm not going to name all these countries, but you can see at what point of the dividend are there. One thing is, for example, Argentina or Chile or Uruguay, and the other is, for example, Bolivia. They are just starting this process. So, some countries will start decreasing in about 25 years, like, for example, Brazil. And smaller and poorer countries are going to start decreasing in 70 years, like, for example, Bolivia. So, demography is unbeatable. And if the region won't use this opportunity to accelerate growth, we will have to confront more severely all the other changes, as the colleague mentioned before, of the aging at a faster rate than other countries. The region is characterized by high levels of inequality. Just, to show a bit of these structural problems of the region, here you have both Gini coefficients and the percentage of population living in poverty or living in extreme poverty in the region. So, besides this, countries have to live with unstable economies and frequent political crises. So, one salient difficulty is the time required to put in place a set of policies that were mentioned. No? Because it's easy to mention those policies, but then the country has to implement them. And they all should require a strong institutionality that is a weak point in Latin American countries. So, policies should be conceived as policies of state, something that is not happening. No? So, the other factor is to take into consideration that the process will be very much dependent on how inequality, and when I say inequality, I talk about several inequalities, not just class, but also gender and other dimensions of inequality will evolve over time. I will leave here.
Because then we can open
Okay.
questions on all of that.
Okay.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Alicia Sani, for including some local representation on the panel. It's a real pleasure to be able to share some thoughts about population change with colleagues visiting from a range of places. One of the great things about going last in a panel like this is that a lot of the background information has already been shared. My job's a lot easier. I can go through things a little bit more quickly. Of course, the downside to going last is that you've already heard most of what I have to say. So hopefully you won't be too bored. I think much of what I have to say is actually really very similar, but I'll try to say it in a different way that I hope can spark a little bit of conversation going forward. So what I want to focus on is heterogeneous population futures. You've already heard about this. Much of the world is growing at a declining pace. But what I really want to focus on is declining population in certain regions. So very similar to what Alex was talking about. And I'm going to focus primarily, I'm going to draw a lot of examples from the case of Japan. Yeah, you might say that's selfish. It's the country I know, makes it easier. But I would argue, yeah, that's true. But I would argue that also Japan is an excellent place to be looking at as we sort of think about what the future for many of these declining populations might look like. Japan, of course, is the oldest country in the world right now, large country, I should say. I think Monaco's older. But I think it's actually the largest, the oldest large country in the history of humanity. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from the Japanese case. It's at the forefront. So as we think about all of these other middle income countries now that are going to be declining at some point in the future, there may be something that we can learn from the Japanese case. So I want to do a little bit on that front. So if you learn nothing else from today, you'll learn that if you want to talk about population futures across the globe, you probably want to use the WPP database. So all four of us with no coordination drew on the same data. So hats off and appreciation to John and his team for all of the work that goes into this. So you've already seen this. The important things I want to say here is that much of the world is in this middle income country. This is a group that includes China, India, Indonesia, countries like Nigeria. This is the group I really want to focus on. It doesn't look like it's declining, but it is declining. This is the high income countries, which of course, Japan, much of East Asia, and Europe, and the English speaking countries all belong to. So we've already learned where these, I'm going to show you information on fertility and population aging. This is a room of demographers. If I ask you where population aging comes from, population decline comes from, you know it's not because people are living longer. You know it's because fertility has declined, as Alex very clearly showed in a couple of cases, Jamaica and South Korea. I just picked, I'm going to show always middle income countries, the projections, high income countries and their projections. And I just randomly picked 3 countries. Japan, because that's what I want to focus on. Brazil and Thailand, because I think these are countries that people often don't think of as really low fertility countries, rapidly aging countries. These are Thailand and Brazil. You can see that they're already below replacement. Japan has had below replacement fertility for about 50 years now. So this is why Japan is the oldest country in the world. But this is where population aging and ultimately population decline come from, of course. Here's just another measure of population aging. We've already seen this a little bit, the percent of the population 65 plus. Obviously, that's a completely arbitrary threshold, but it's conventional, so I'm going to show it. Japan, as I told you, is the oldest country, projected to reach about 35-36% of the population over 65. South Korea projected to reach about 40, so 2 in 5 South Koreans in the not so distant future will be over the age of 65. You can see Brazil and Thailand. I guess use this. Brazil, maybe I can't. Brazil and Thailand also really quite old. And look at this, middle income countries. These are countries that we think of as, you know, developing countries in a sense. 1 in 5 is projected to be 1 in 5, 20% of the population projected to be 65 and over. So rate of population growth, you've already seen this. I told you the same information. So I'm going through it quickly. But I just want to highlight the fact that Japan, among many other countries, is already declining at about 400,000 to 500,000 people per year. Going forward, it's not going to reach 1 million, but 800,000 people decline per year in Japan going forward. And you can see Thailand, Brazil are on similar trajectories. And you can see that by the end of the projection period, about 2060, middle income countries, these countries again that we think of as developing countries, are going to be, as we've already seen, at 0% growth. So this is, fundamental change, some of which is consistent with basic demographic transition theory, maybe this, and a lot of it is fundamentally inconsistent with our only basic theoretical tenet, sustained below replacement fertility. We didn't, I don't think, foresee that coming. And this is where you get the population decline and really rapid aging, of course. So one of the things that I really want to emphasize that hasn't come up so far is a little bit more sociological, I guess. We can talk about heterogeneity across the globe in population futures, aging, fertility trends, and ultimately population decline. But I think one of the things that misses is massive internal heterogeneity in aging. And I think that this is critically important when we think about distribution of resources, we think about access to amenities, access to services, local economies, local cultures, local histories, and things like this. And what I want to do to really hopefully highlight that heterogeneity is to show you what I think are some pretty striking figures from Japan. This is not the official population projections, but it's a group, private group in Japan that does municipality-specific projections. So what this is population change between the 2050 and 2020 censuses. Okay, the red here, red and pink are growth. So you can see Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, the big mega city urban areas have some growth. Pretty much everywhere else, yellow is small decline, and the blue, progressively darker blue, is more population decline. Much of Japan is already declining in this period right now at reasonably high rates, 5 to 10% over a 5-year period. Okay. What I want to show you next is from 2020 to 2050, I believe, a 30-year period. So obviously, the change will be greater. It's a longer period of time. But I want you to just, I think the figure will speak for itself. This is up to 50% decline, up to 50% decline, the dark blue. These are basically parts of Japan that are essentially disappearing. I don't want to be overly dramatic, but it's true. And I think that, this is something that we've known was coming for decades, and it's coming to fruition. But I think if you just sort of imagine, maybe you don't know much about Japan, but you know a lot about another country, and imagine what happens if you have this complete, tremendous regional heterogeneity in the pace of population aging and the extent to which populations are essentially disappearing in areas of becoming non-functional as economies and places to live. And I think this is the future of Japan. And I think, again, this has lessons, I would hope, for places thinking about similar patterns that will unfold elsewhere. Japan is obviously not the only place in the world that has a high concentration of economic activity and population in a small number of areas.
Yeah, isn't it greater than 50% decline? You said up to 50%, but the others, the next. Seems to imply.
Yeah, minus 30 to minus 50, more than minus 50. Yeah. Sorry about that. Right. B is the bottom line. I mean, I think that it's beyond any of these. 30% over a 3-year period is massive. A 30-year period is massive. So I think that this is really telling and food for thought. Let me just quickly move ahead. We talked a little bit about immigration and the importance of immigration, and thinking about the fact that there are a lot of growing countries now that are sending countries, and there are a lot of countries like Japan, Germany, and elsewhere that are aspiring receiving countries, aspiring to greater or lesser degrees, perhaps. But these are countries, I think it may have been Alice who said, these are countries without histories of being an immigrant receiving country. And let's just take a look. This is Japan's population, projected total population, projected labor force, 20 to 64. And we can think about the importance of immigration in offsetting the decline going forward. Here is the total foreign resident population in Japan today. So not really close. And let me just quickly, I realize I'm a little bit over. These are older population projections from 2000, but basically what they did was to take the projected population in 2050 and ask how much immigration would be needed to keep the population at a constant level today, and what percent of the population would be immigrants and their descendants. 18% of the Japanese population in 2050 would be immigrants or descendants. 30% if we wanted to keep the labor force constant at today's level. That's 381,000 immigrants per year, or 609,000 immigrants per year. The orders of magnitude different than the actual levels of immigration in Japan right now. So you can see how difficult this is for countries like Japan, China, Korea, soon to be the 3 oldest countries in the world. These aren't countries that have a well-established set of policies or even a history of receiving immigrants. So this is not something that is going to be easy. And I think it's important to also keep in mind that today's sending countries are also going to be in need of immigrants in the not so distant future. So it's not so clear where the immigrants are going to come from. So I realize I'm over time, but hopefully the conversation maybe spurred some thoughts in the context of the other talks that came before about some of the issues that we really need to think about with respect to population decline, and maybe what we can learn for the broader world from these very few countries that are really experiencing massive population decline already. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I would ask you if you could sit in the table and we can open, we have a few minutes for discussion. We can take questions from the public, and otherwise also we have people watching this online. So at least when you are going to speak, it's important. So who wants to go first? Yes, Isa.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I guess my question's to Alex. You mentioned that the demographic transition in low-and middle-income countries will be different from high-income countries, as it's being much faster in terms of aging and decline. You said that we don't really know why, but I'm curious, like, do you have any theory of why is it happening faster in those countries rather than not?
The answer is simple. As the success of organized family planning programs and education and many other, there are a lot of opportunities we have today that will affect, if you think about female labor force participation. So when you go back 100, 200 years ago, the world was very different from it is today. So it's all these things together. That and if I take the example of South Korea, why are women not having children? I mean, I think it's not just given the current policies to give grants to families with children under 1 year of age. Sorry, to give grants to families with children under 1 year of age. But the challenge is that if you don't have a system where women can combine childbearing with professional careers, then and they have to choose between one or the other, the choice is easier for many of them. You know, you choose your career. And so we need to really recognize those. So why is it declining very fast? I think it's it's a lot of things. Family planning, it's female education, it's opportunities in labor force participation, quite a lot of things, and changing marriage patterns as well.
Yes. So my question is for whoever wants to answer it. So if demographers have mostly thought about it, at least in the past, we've thought about population growth is kind of a negative externality. Population growth is something that we hoped to slow, and we were worried if we didn't slow it, then there'd be all sorts of negative things that happen in the world. So I've been reading a lot about what people who aren't demographers today think about population growth. And what I found was a little bit surprising. A lot of business leaders and investment professionals are super worried about slower population growth. If you flip the TV to CNBC, you'll find people complaining about lower returns in the future. Major investment firms have decided that the long-term 10% rate of return of the stock market is going to slow down because of population growth declining. Individuals involved in the defense industry are worried about slower population growth. And even some of our colleagues in economics who think about innovative individuals and geniuses who occur kind of in the tails of populations, they're worried about sort of this slowdown in the rate of increase of very clever people. So when we think about 8 billion going eventually to 10.4 billion, is 10.4 billion too high or too low? I only ask it because I know it's a question you don't want to.
Well, I say, first of all, I don't think there's an optimal size for the human population or for the population of any particular country. I think, like I was saying in my remarks, what matters is the speed of change more than anything. That's really and that's where we see the imbalances in the age structure. Our population is growing very rapidly, has this heavy concentration at the youngest ages and ever growing cohorts of children that have to be educated and ever increasing expenses to make that happen. Whereas populations with very low levels of fertility have these inverted pyramid age structures that become problematic in terms of intergenerational support and so forth. So I don't think it's a question of how many people so much as how we get from here to there that really matters.
Just to illustrate, in a stable population with a total fertility rate of 1.5, the population will shrink in 64 years. Whereas with a rate of 1.9, it will take 230 years. So I think that's the pace of change explain everything.
So I want to just throw one, since you said we could all respond as we see fit. So I think this is one of the interesting places where the work that we do and the way we think about things as demographers intersects with other parts of the world. I think you can pick anything you're interested in, and you can find something negative about rapid population growth or something positive about rapid population growth. Similarly, you can find all kinds of things negative about rapid population decline, or things that are great about rapid population decline. Perhaps, John referenced a couple of times climate impact or environmental impact of population. Well, hey, that might be a great thing about population decline at a global level or at a regional level, for that matter. And I don't know what the balance is or how you weight all of these different pros and cons of broad population change in a way that lets you pop out an estimate of net positive or net negative outcomes. But I think it's interesting though to think about how other people. I think we take a pretty agnostic sort of broad view of things like this, but I think it's interesting to see how those in different parts of the world, the industry or whatever, sort of think about these things in really narrow ways. Yeah.
Can I just make a last comment on that? I think not only the issue of change, the speed of change matters a lot, but it's not only the speed of change in population, it's the speed of change in everything else. So, are we concerned about a labor force that might be shrinking? Well, if we can raise the rate of productivity of labor faster, then, you can counter it that way. And are we concerned about how many people are consuming and, you know, emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere? Or are we more concerned about the rate of increase in the per capita contributions? You know, I mean, and I think sometimes we look at population change and we say, oh, that's growing so fast. These other things are changing faster or have the potential to change faster. So, you know, we have to keep that in perspective too.
Thanks so much for this. So I guess I have a question for Jim and a question for Alex. The question for Jim is, I mean, that map is just, I can't imagine being a government official in Japan looking at that map. Like it's like a movie, like, you know, watching one of those, you know, end of times movies where, you know, some meteor is coming to destroy the earth. And I mean, but that is not a movie. I mean, you're showing a map of extinction. You know, I don't know how. So I'm just wondering what is the national conversation? I mean, it's like an emptying out of towns and villages and empty neighborhoods, and I mean, it's so I wonder if you could talk a bit more about what it's like, what the conversation is like in country. And so similarly for Alex, in Nigeria, I'm trying to wrap my head around a doubling every 18 years. I mean, it's mind-boggling in Nigeria. So I'm wondering again if you have any knowledge of what that experience is like in country. Is how are people thinking about it? How is the country trying to plan around that kind of rapid growth? So just basically talking more about what the inside of this rapid growth has happened.
Okay, so good question. I'll try to be brief since we don't have a lot of time, but I think maybe just to start an answer, context is important. It's important to realize that, you know, a lot of these municipalities that are dark blue in the second one, these are relatively rural areas. 90% of the Japanese population lives in cities, and 35% lives in the Tokyo metropolitan area. And if you include the 10 or 11 big cities, it's the vast majority of the population. So these are places where there already is not a lot of population, which doesn't, you know, mitigate the importance of these places kind of disappearing. But this is something that the government has known about. As far as I can tell, the early 1970s was the first point at which people started talking about disappearing or shrinking municipalities or regions. And there's all kinds of efforts, sort of reverse taxes, promoting local tourism. But I think there's a resignation that many of these places, there's nothing you can, it's too far gone. And you've already seen, you know, the kinds of numbers that would be necessary in terms of immigration to keep the population constant. And there's no remote chance that that's going to happen. So increased mechanization and things like that, that's not going to repopulate rural areas. So I think resignation. Yeah.
I don't work on Japan, but if I can add a word there, one of the things that's also happening currently is, if you think about Japan, and it's the same issue in Spain and Italy and all that, vacant homes is becoming a social problem. And how do you manage that? Because we don't link it up to population decline and all of that. And even when you think about rural areas losing people and not having people, we do not think about the implications of that for climate change, for environmental change. There is most of the people there take care of the forest and the lands and all that. And if it is unkept and there are no people there and they don't have a fire, I think what happened in Hawaii would be a child story to what could happen in cities where the surrounding areas are now left in some ways. And so there are real issues of population decline that go beyond aging. Some of the work I've done is suggesting that if you think about East Asia as a whole, and you look at young people, there's a deficit of about 15 to 20% of girls to boys. And what does that mean for the marriage market? What does that mean for social relationships and all of that? So there's quite a lot of things that are there that we are not, I think, paying as much attention to. With respect to Niger, which is the other side of the whole story, Niger is one of the countries in Africa now where it's been in the news more recently with the coup there that's happened and all that. And the point I've made is when you have a country that is doubling every 18.5 years, it doesn't, the ability of that country to double investments and the stock of health facilities and healthcare workers, education institutions and teachers and jobs and roads and houses and all every 18 years, almost impossible. So what you're going to see is continued deterioration in the coverage of these services that's already very poor. 70% of the women are not in school, or girls are not in school, and you see that declining more. And so what happens there is that it does not matter whether you have a military dictatorship or a liberal democracy. The ability of the central government to actually manage the expectations of the population will continue to be weakened, and we will continue to see this constant change in many ways. And unfortunately, because of the military coup, if you think about many development partners, they are withdrawing from the country, and the investments in family planning programs and education programs, and that will only make things worse. So it's not it's not an easy situation, and Niger is not alone. It's the same challenge we have in the Sahel region, bringing DRC, Congo, and Central African Republic. It's just the entire region in many ways.
Can you collect a few of the last questions?
Yes, thank you for this very great panel. So I guess if I'm broadly understanding correctly, I guess in the next 100 or so years, there's going to be a lot of change. But then after that, in the far future, once we're all long gone, it sounds like the world is going to stabilize in a very different fashion than it is today. So even though you're academics, I wonder if you could speculate on how the future of humanity will look like, whether it be politically or socially or economically. Any of you.
Yeah, thanks for this. This is great. I guess I have somewhat of a similar question, and one that also kind of dies off from Jim's point about the truly unprecedented nature of the prevalence of political in human history. So acknowledging that we are now in this kind of realm of educating experts. You're all experts in this field. It would be great to hear your critical opinion on the possibility of some kind of reversal of fertility decline, some kind of bounce back effect, almost in a kind of evolutionary sense. I know there's been a little bit of work on this from people talking about like J-shaped theories of the relationship between fertility and development. But yeah, any thoughts on that?
Jonathan?
Thank you. So I have a question kind of, more broadly on the role of migration kind of for anybody, where it seems like kind of you have this dilemma where the currently aging countries are, some of them like are just not, destination countries at all. And like the other half of them are having like a really big backlash to migration. And then of course, all these sending countries today, as has been mentioned, with these large working populations, age populations are going to be the ones with Asian population structure tomorrow. And then of course, there's balancing freedom of movement as a human right versus brain drain of the most skilled workers. So what is the role of migration? Like, is it, a sustainable solution? Are we going to have like an increasingly small number of sending countries, and then among receiving countries, just like increasing competition for just the most skilled workers? What is the role kind of over this 100-year time horizon?
Let me read a couple of the multiple questions we have online, and then I'll open for the final round. So we have John Bongers online asking, there's a striking absence of discussion on policy options. Future demographic trends can be changed by beneficial interventions. Why not focus on how to improve those trends? That's one question. Another question, Kathleen Mogelhart is pointing to the Alex point on the age of marriage in Niger, and is asking, is this something that is going to be incorporated in UN population projections in some way?
What will be incorporated?
The age of marriage, like this.
The
parent. Okay. Okay, so now we have. I'm take the international migration. I'm going to incorporate.
Well, first, I would say that international migration is the most difficult variable to predict and to project. because it depends on many other factors that affect the probability to migrate. And I would say, I don't know, from now to 100 years, but looking in the near future, the forces driving migration have been changing considerably. So there is an increasing number of people migrating out of hopelessness, distress, insecurity, environmental degradation. So these are forces that are less predictable and they operate more rapidly. And just to give an example of my region, in just 2 or 3 years, 7 million people moved out of Venezuela and went to live in neighbor countries that have never received immigrants. So it is very hard to imagine. One is to think the role of migration, that would be fantastic, to cover for the process of aging. But the other is the political side. And we are living in a world that is increasingly more anti-immigrants. So we have governments that are being more and more xenophobic and using the immigration card as part of the political. So I would say I cannot imagine migration as it is now working the way we would like to see. I think that we have to work more conceptually now on what does it mean to have these types of flows. We've been always dividing the word of migration in forced migration and voluntary migration. I think that way to look at migration have changed. We have to develop new tools to understand better what is going on. But I'm not so optimistic of the growth of migration in the years to come.
Maybe I'll give a real quick response to 2 other questions. So Paloma, your question. I mean, that's a huge question, thinking into the future about fertility trends. I mean, the easy answer to that, I picked this because I think it's an easy one to answer in a sense and impossible to answer in another sense. It's easy to answer if we look at history. And, I sort of said, let's look at the countries that are already out there at the forefront to learn what might be in store for those that are following that trajectory. If I'm not mistaken, there is no country that has fallen below replacement fertility for a period of time that has ever recovered to replacement fertility. Tell me if others know differently from that, but I think that that's some reason to be relatively pessimistic about the likelihood of a rebound in fertility in the near future, at least. Of course, at some point in the distant future, that there presumably has to be some rebound or stabilization. The other one with respect to the policy, obviously, really brief, and I know this isn't the answer that is being sought here, but I'm taking the easy way out again. Policy responses to population change are obviously critical, and these are, I would argue in East Asia, these are at the very highest, level of concern, population policies. And again, to be selfish and focus on the country I know, population policies, fertility policies, immigration policies have been implemented. Hundreds have been implemented in Japan over the past 30 or 40 years. And one could argue that they haven't really worked very well. Fertility is about 1.3, 1.4. Maybe in the absence of all of the fertility policies that have been implemented, it looks like South Korea. It's 0.7, 0.8, I don't know. But it certainly hasn't returned to anywhere near replacement. Immigration policies. Like many other countries, Japan has increasingly liberal immigration policies, but people aren't coming to the point that Jordan made a minute ago. And another policy that's been talked about for decades is trying to decrease the massive concentration of population in a small number of urban areas to deal with some of the rural depopulation issues that were shown in those maps. Inertia is tough. The vast majority of the businesses, job opportunities, educational opportunities, amenities, they're in the big cities. It's hard to move people via policy in a democracy. Yeah. So I'm skeptical on that.
I don't know for sure. Nobody can tell you what we can look at, and you look at the projections from the UN. The longer you go, the better the confidence in terms of those estimates. They are less reliable than what we know about the next 15, 20, 30 years. But if you go into 70 years, you have more uncertainties around those estimates in many ways. But one of the things around migration is really it's a temporary solution. And as many low and middle income countries wake up to the reality of how this is affecting them and their future, they may be able to institute policies that limit out migration of their young people. And it will then change the equation around how do you then respond to that. And as important as migration is, that's one of the things within the UN that's, it's really no agency that you say you have, IOM is not part of the UN system in many ways, but you don't have that common agreement around how do you manage that. Many poor countries are spending a lot of their resources training these people, and then it's really not happening in many ways. And so that's something that needs to become, and that's maybe as you think about current governance of global institutions and global arrangements, whether it's the UN and Security Council or the World Bank and IMF and all of those things, is really thinking, what does this mean as we have this massive change in the distribution of the global population? And that's coming and is surfacing a lot more. But my sense is this, I think John Bongas talked about what the policy options, and it's very limited. I think for me, one of the things that the policies that we have adopted for addressing population decline has largely been in rich countries. And that approach, if you think about South Korea spending 200 billion over a 16-year period, and the question, I mean, with the conversations that I've had, I have a couple of students from South Korea, but if you can actually change gender norms, why is it women, you can't have children outside of marriage? That's one. Now you're facing an existential threat. You have to choose between career and family. And all of these are things that affect, are important and need to be addressed. So policy is not just about making money, giving money to couples to have children. I think we need to be able to look at those policies and see how can they be implemented in a way that then allows for and evaluate their impact as well. So one last point to make. I think for many countries, the reality of their demographic, if you sit in Japan and you are in Tokyo, with the millions of people there, you may not actually feel some of these, and I think this is the irony of the whole situation. You can look at the country as a whole and you see these patterns emerging. But when you sit in your office, you're still stuck in traffic, you're still dealing with people and all of that. And what you see in front of you takes priority. And we need to begin to invest in more research and publication like the work that you presented today. Show what these patterns are going to look like as you go forward. Maybe then it can get the type of traction we are expecting it to get, so that you can develop effective policies to see how do you respond to those. But I'm not aware of any country where you've moved back. It doesn't matter how much money you provide to women. And I think in Hungary and some parts of Scandinavia, they exempt them from, if you have the fourth child or so, you are not going to pay taxes the rest of your life. They're not taking it off. Because the cost of raising a child is not just $5,000 you get in day one. It's a 20-year commitment. It's a 25-year commitment, and it's hundreds of thousands, and not just and that's something that we've not really factored in. in thinking about policy options.
Thank you. So in that note, we're gonna stop. Any other questions, please approach the panel. We'll obviously hear what you're looking at. And thank you very much for participating.